Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing U.S. policy in Syria and the continuous protests against the Iranian regime. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Jim Phillips, Senior Research Fellow for the Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jim. I want to start by talking about the last comment by Secretary Pompeo when he mentioned to de Mistura, the special envoy from the United Nations, that this proposal by him and Russia, and obviously the Assad regime in Iran, of returning the Syrian refugees inside of Syria is something that is way before it's the right time to be talking about this, and that we need to be waiting on something like that. What do you think this entails of the American position on Syria, or the strategy, if there is any?
Well, I think Secretary of State Pompeo was correct in pointing out that most of these Syrian refugees fled the Assad regime and Russian bombing. Today, it appears there's the regime and the Russians are getting ready to crank up an offensive in northwest Syria, in Idlib, which will drive even more Syrians out of the country. And yet, for diplomatic reasons, they're talking about returning refugees. I don't see why refugees would want to return to Syria as long as Assad is still in a position to murder them indiscriminately. And I think the Russians, of all people, are the last ones that should be demanding a return of the refugees, since their bombing essentially drove most of those refugees out of the country, because ISIS wasn't allowing people to escape the territory that it controlled.
Mm-hmm. But do you think this entails that there is a strategy that is very specific, very, very clear on when and how? Because it did mention, the statement by Secretary Pompeo, that those things will be probably agreed upon when there's a political solution, going back to the Geneva process. And then he basically mentioned that there is going to be after the elections. So the elections is always like the big question mark about basically accepting an election where Assad is allowed to run as a candidate.
That's right, and Assad has run many false elections before. He'll just do it again. I'm not sure what the Pompeo statement says about the administration's overall strategy, because to me, like to many other people, it's difficult to discern the precise outlines of that strategy beyond the prioritization of the defeat of ISIS as the top U.S. priority, which I think is correct. Secondly, a commitment, at least a verbal commitment, to containing Iranian influence in Syria. But that said, some of the U.S. actions on the ground haven't matched the rhetoric.
What about basically the Helsinki meeting that we've talked about a lot already? But, do you think this statement by Secretary Pompeo tells anything about what actually happened in that meeting, the private meeting that the president had with Putin?
I think it shows that if there was any discussion of the refugees, then it's still up in the air about what will happen, at least in terms of U.S.-Russian negotiations. And the Russians have been, I think, hyping some kind of agreement, supposedly that Putin reached with Trump in private. But on the American side, I'm hearing there was no such agreement. There were tentative discussions, but they did not produce a decision.
Mm-hmm. Especially that Russia actually wanted the United States to withdraw from Syria militarily. Do you think this type of decision could be made unilaterally by the president?
Well, in the American system, the president does have the power technically to do that, but I think it would be a mistake to unilaterally withdraw from Syria unless or until there are some kind of arrangements made to protect the people in eastern Syria from the return of the Islamic State at a minimum, and also to protect them from Iran and pro-Iranian militias that dominate in about 80% of the militias in eastern Syria are report to Iran, not to Russia or to Damascus. And that's something I think that the Trump administration would be wise to remember.
And obviously the administration does have other members who probably have their own ideas about what should happen. Especially, obviously we know that Secretary Pompeo has his own outlook. He served in the Congress, but after that he was the head of the CIA, which means that he knows so much about what's actually happening. Also, there's the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. What do you think their opinion is about the ongoing strategy? What do you think they will accept, basically?
I think if they had their way, they would link the return of refugees to some kind of political transition in Syria, because it's ridiculous to expect refugees to return to the not-so-loving arms of a regime that has massacred them repeatedly. And I think that at least would be the bottom line. But beyond that, I don't think there's any great desire to take military action to overthrow the Assad regime. I think Assad stepping down is a long-term diplomatic goal, but not a military goal. The focus is more on ISIS and maybe a little beyond that HTS in the Al-Qaeda splinter group in northwestern Syria. But the Iranian influence is very much on their radar, and I think for that reason they will be reluctant to unilaterally abandon Syria to Iranian influence.
So you mentioned now also the Jabhat Tahrir Sham in Idlib. That's also another big question that everybody keeps talking about, what could happen there, because there's over 2 million people who fled from every other part of Syria, that their city's been destroyed and they're there. There's the Turkish position that they're trying to negotiate something with Russia. What could happen in that area? Because there is that element, but that there's others. What do you think the best solution for this very complicated situation?
Well, I think the worst case would be if the regime backed by Russia and Iran goes in there, it'll compound the humanitarian catastrophe, and it would benefit HTS because right now many Syrians have rejected their leadership because they've been mistreated by this Al-Qaeda splinter group in the past. Who has lorded over them, has dismantled local defense groups and tried to merge them into a radical Islamist caliphate, but not by name, but a very harsh brand of Islamic laws meted out to the people. And if the Assad regime goes in, then that could actually rescue many of these militants in the eyes of the people. They've already been discredited, but that would set up a long-term open wound that Islamist extremists could take advantage of.
What about Turkey and their proposal to Russia, and obviously now the deteriorating relationship between Turkey and the United States?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that President Erdogan has chosen to lead Turkey away from the West, away from the NATO alliance, has taken hostages not only of Americans, including Turkish-American people working at the embassy. I mean, beyond the Reverend Brunson, there's also a NASA scientist, a Turkish citizen who has been arrested and has held as hostage. There are Europeans. Just today, the Turkish police arrested a German citizen on what's believed to be trumped-up charges. And I think that's evidence that President Erdogan is increasingly acting as an enemy and not an ally. But then he expects the benefit of the doubt when it comes to requesting the extradition of his former ally and now political bête noire, Mr. Gulen, who was in exile in the U.S. So Erdogan can't have it both ways. I mean, if he's an ally, he should act like an ally, not be buying Russian radars that could give Moscow information about the F-35 stealth jets that Turkey also is buying. If he continues on this path, then I think the U.S. Congress will deny him those F-35 jets, and I think U.S.-Turkish relations are in for a very rocky time.
So how is that going to influence any type of decision that Russia makes, and obviously any collaboration between Russia and Turkey in the Syrian province of Idlib?
Well, unfortunately, that will increase Russian leverage, weaken Turkey's bargaining position vis-a-vis Moscow, and could lead Turkey to reach out to increasingly radical Islamist groups beyond the Muslim Brotherhood type groups that it already has in its stable.
I want to actually go to one of your articles that you wrote, that you said Obama really didn't leave much of many options for the United States to act in Syria. What do you think what's left now for the United States to do? What could the United States achieve now in Syria to change the situation or make it better?
Well, I think at a minimum you could say the Trump administration has forcefully defended the red line on the use of chemical weapons that President Obama initially set and then abandoned. The administration has ordered 2 strikes against the Syrian Air Force positions on air bases that were guilty of those chemical strikes. And I don't think anyone doubts that if they use chemical weapons again that way, then the administration will react maybe much stronger, because the first strike in 2017 was limited in scope, and only U.S. Planes participated, but the most recent one in April 2018 involved not only American planes, but British and French planes, and they hit many more targets. So that suggests that if there is a follow-up, it'll be much bigger.
And also now, we can talk about the Iranian situation in terms of Syria. I mean, right now the rhetoric is that the United States basically is accepting Russia's role in Syria. However, it's not going to allow Iran to stay. The pressures are economic on Iran, but we know that Israel has its own position on Iran as well. What do you think this entails in terms of what's going to happen between Russia, Iran, and Assad in the coming days in Syria?
Well, in my view, Israel and Iran are fighting a slow-motion war inside Syria, and it could speed up, accelerate, and become a hot war very quickly. The Russians have promised that they will restrain and constrain Iranians and keep them 50 miles from the Israeli border. But the Russians have made many promises about Syria in the past that they've subsequently violated. And it's unclear to me if they have the willingness and even the ability to restrain Iran there. Because I think although many of the Russian and Iranian goals inside Syria are compatible, they also have diverging long-term interests there, and I don't think Putin minds it when Israel reaches out and blows up Iranian positions, if only because that strengthens Russian influence with Assad compared to Iranian influence. And I think the Russians see Iran as somewhat of a competitor in the Middle East. It's not all it's not all a rosy relationship of allies. I think it's a tactical marriage of convenience. And Israel has very good relations with Russia. Netanyahu with Putin have met I think 3 times this year. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is determined to limit Iranian influence, at least in Western Syria. But I doubt the Russians are going to follow through on their promises to keep Iran away from the border.
In your opinion, now obviously we see that protests are increasing inside of Iran a lot. Many people expected that this is going to be in waves where things are going to escalate and then they're going to, kind of calm down and so on and so forth. Now we're seeing the escalation inside of Iran. How do you think the United States should be handling these protests? And do you think they're significant enough that this, in the medium term or the long term, could threaten the regime?
I think this is a major threat to the regime, and it's increasing in scope and intensity. And what's interesting about the most recent wave of protests is compared to the wave back in 2009, which was centered on Tehran and was upper class, middle class Iranians that historically have chafed at the harsh repression meted out by the regime. This latest wave of protests has occurred along smaller cities and towns and rural areas that formerly were considered bastions of political support for the regime. And the fact that they are turning against the regime is very significant. But that said, these protests are not very well organized. They lack national leaders and unifying themes. They don't have a coherent, cohesive program. And the Iranian regime is very heavily armed, can depend on the Revolutionary Guards to knock heads or shoot people in the streets as they've done.
And they're doing that.
And they're doing that, from day to day. You read about protesters being shot. So I don't think an overthrow of the regime is going to happen anytime soon. And for that reason, I don't think Washington or other countries should assume that the regime is just going to go away, because it's proven it has staying power. Mm-hmm. But what the U.S. can do is drive up the costs of the regime's hostile policies and show the Iranian people that their economic problems are caused by the regime, either in terms of economic mismanagement and corruption, or in terms of foreign adventures that squander billions of dollars of Iranian oil money on propping up Assad and propping up Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. It's unclear what economic benefit, if any, this is for the Iranian people. And I would argue this shows that Iran's national interests diverge with the ideological revolutionary interests of Iran's Islamist regime. And the longer the regime keeps that up, the stronger sanctions against the regime get, the more Iranian people are going to realize that their best interests demand that they change their government.
This administration is known to be, President Trump, during his campaign, he was really adamant about Iran. That's one thing he really insisted on, and it seems that he is following through. The same thing with John Bolton. The same thing with, the administration has many people who've been really clear, and they have their own strategy and look and view on the Iranian regime. Do you think the administration is actually living up to its the expectations that world have put on it in terms of the Iran strategy? Because you're an expert on this.
Yeah, I think the administration has taken the appropriate hardline course on the nuclear issue. It's pushing back very strongly with economic sanctions, but I have yet to see follow through in Syria with regard to Iran. And some of the president's statements about wanting to withdraw the 2,000 U.S. troops, estimated 2,000 troops in eastern Syria, that really could undermine containment of Iran. If that happens without some kind of arrangements being made with our NATO allies or Arab allies to replace the U.S. troops to keep ISIS or the Islamic State from resurging and keep Iran from expanding, then that could redound to Iran's benefit. So I think the jury is still out on whether the Trump administration is doing maximum pressure on Iran. I think it is on the economic front, but not so much in Syria, at least yet.
Okay, so the economical front, you think those sanctions they snapped now in August, and they will be snapping again more sanctions, very harsh ones, in November. Do you think those are going to be enough to really tighten up the regime's ability, the financial ability, to basically keep paying salaries and funding its militias?
Well, I've maintained from the beginning that economic sanctions alone are not enough to stop a determined march to a nuclear weapon in Tehran any more than they stopped the North Koreans. And even Pakistan, which the U.S. put sanctions on because of its nuclear program. I mean, their prime minister, Bhutto, was quoted as saying the Pakistani people would eat grass in order to get a nuclear weapon. So if a state has...
Meaning he would make them eat grass.
Yeah. that he would be willing to tolerate U.S. sanctions that would hurt them economically. And I think it was like a truthful hyperbole he was making, that they weren't really going to eat grass. But he exaggerated a point to stress that, this is a question of priorities. And so I think ultimately what will keep Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon is a credible threat of military force. It's always been that way, and there's other ways of, shaping their cost-benefit calculus and by imposing sanctions as well. But sanctions can, at a minimum, greatly reduce the ability of Iran's Islamist totalitarian regime to cause trouble in the Middle East, because they'll have a lot less money to spread around among their surrogate insurgent and terrorist network. They're estimated to spend, I think it's at least $6 billion every year to prop up Assad. It'll be a lot harder for them to continue doing that. It'll be a lot harder for them to keep the scale of aid that they offer Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. And I think over time, the Middle East balance of power will shift as Iran grows economically weaker.
When we talk about, that's a very good example, the North Korean situation, because a lot of people do see some similarities. And as we saw, North Korea does have a nuclear weapon today. Were the economical sanctions on North Korea similar to what we see now on Iran? What are the differences there? Why do we see the administration thinking that it's going to be somewhat enough to pressure Iran through economical sanctions alone?
Well, I would say that economic sanctions alone wouldn't do it, as your question implies. But I think the big difference between Iran and North Korea is that Iran is in a much stronger economic position by virtue of its control of oil. That's a strategic commodity that is very much in demand, especially in recent months with the chaos in Venezuela, the problems in Libya that have affected Libyan oil exports, there's problems in Nigeria, and that has led to tight world oil market and price volatility. And because of that, it'll be difficult for the administration to shut off all of Iran's oil exports. I mean, it has set a goal of zero exports, but I think it realizes that's unrealistic because in the short run, there may not be alternatives to Iranian oil. I mean, U.S. shale oil can compensate to a degree, but some countries, particularly, say, India, China, maybe South Korea, will have trouble immediately shifting away from Iranian oil. And in fact, China has said it's not going to respect the sanctions. So China may actually buy more Iranian oil, and that will help the Iranian regime, unfortunately.
Yes. In terms of countries like Syria, and specifically in terms of the Houthis also, what could the U.S. do to basically minimize the Iranian influence on the militias like the Houthis and Hezbollah?
Well, I think the Houthis it's a very difficult situation because the longer the war goes on, the more the Houthis are pushed into Iran's arms. And the Ansar Allah group is definitely following Hezbollah's path and is definitely working very closely with Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards, as well as with some trainers and advisors from Hezbollah. They're being trained in Lebanon or in Yemen itself. So the longer that war goes on, I think, unfortunately, the harder it will be to drive a wedge between the Houthis and Iran. So,
but what can Iran offer the Houthis if they're cut off, financially, if they don't have that much more money to give, and then if there's enough, basically, barriers from like the Red Sea or from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf?
Well,
to not allow them to receive shipments,
right.
Basically.
If they could hermetically seal the Red Sea, then that would deny the Houthis the supplies. Unfortunately, because the port of Hodeidah is the artery through which like 90% of humanitarian aid goes to Yemen, the Iranians are able to smuggle a lot of things in with that, just as they're able to smuggle things into Gaza, which is also very tightly secure. The borders are secure, but there are tunnels, there are ships, and there are ways to smuggle things inside humanitarian aid shipments. So I don't think that that will ever be able to be totally sealed. So to me, if the Houthis see the need to stay close to Iran because they're defining that war as an existential threat to their survival, then it's important to, and I think that's probably pretty true, then it would be good to end that war. And then the only thing Iran could offer is arms. And the Houthis are going to need reconstruction and economic aid, and they would maybe look elsewhere for that.
What do you think the options are to ending the war between the Houthis and the rest of the people in Yemen, and obviously the legitimate government in Yemen?
Well, I think at a minimum they have to take the port of Hodeidah and show the Houthis that the tide has turned and that they can save themselves a lot of trouble by negotiating now and try to form some kind of more stable political arrangement inside Yemen that would limit Iranian influence. But that's going to be a very tough diplomatic goal.
So joining basically some sort of a joint leadership between the Houthis and the legitimate government?
I'm not sure joint leadership is doable, but probably greater autonomy in northern Yemen from the central government, because also the central government is facing the threat of southern separatism. So there may be a way to tailor some kind of a federal solution that could give the Houthis and their southern secessionists greater local control, but still keep them within Yemen.
Exactly. So those are the solutions that you see more feasible.
Yeah. I think in the long run, but unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to get there in the short run.
In terms of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah now controls Lebanon, according to many, especially after the last elections, how do you view the leverage the United States has over Hezbollah? And obviously, I don't think it's even possible to talk about, realistic to talk about cutting the ties between Hezbollah and Iran.
Right. I mean, Hezbollah is a Frankenstein monster created by Iran. And I don't think there's any possibility of driving a wedge between Iran and Hezbollah any more than there is between driving a wedge between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. But yet you still hear people in Washington or elsewhere saying that. I think that's crazy. The U.S. Can step up sanctions against Hezbollah. The Obama administration pulled its punches in criminal investigations against Hezbollah related businessmen who were smuggling things around the world, especially South and Central America,
Drugs.
Western
Yes.
Africa. And I think the Trump administration can do a lot more in ratcheting up pressure on Hezbollah's illegal criminal enterprises, because as we've seen very often in the world, that some of the same people that are smuggling things across borders are also cooperating or becoming terrorists themselves. And I think Hezbollah is a clear case of that.
Do you think this administration is doing enough? Because we heard about a case in Argentina, and now Hezbollah's case is brought up back about their previous attacks that they've carried out, their illegal, obviously the drug cartel that they run around the world. Is there enough steps? Do you see any potential to have a more serious kind of separate strategy for Hezbollah specifically?
Yeah, I think the administration will be unveiling new sanctions on Hezbollah and also putting pressure on its allies, especially the Europeans, who continue to cling to the fiction that there's a political wing and a military wing in Hezbollah. And I think they're going to be pushing Europeans to take stronger action against Hezbollah.
It's always the dilemma now about the European position on Iran, on Hezbollah. When Obama was really eager to get the nuclear deal, Europe was against him, and France was one of the leading countries who had a problem with the JCPOA. Why are we seeing that change of heart by Europe? What is the drive behind it?
I think there's a lot of factors at play here. One, unfortunately, is many European governments resent the Trump administration. I think it's no secret they felt a lot more affinity and work much closer with the Obama administration. In many ways, Mr. Obama was a European in outlook in some of the ways he looked at the world.
Even though he didn't show up to the funeral of the victims of the bombing that happened in France, the major one, and that was a shocker. He was accused of being an isolationist also. As well.
Right, and I think he did that for political reasons, because his argument has been that Al-Qaeda's on the run and that he deserved credit for killing bin Laden, but yet he was also the same president that said ISIS is a JV team and didn't take the rise of the Islamic State, first in Western Iraq, then in Eastern Syria, seriously. And then when he did take action, it was very limited action, constrained by politically imposed constraints on the use of military power. It was ridiculous where they refused to attack ISIS oil fields or even the trucks that were delivering smuggled ISIS oil until they had dropped leaflets asking the truck drivers to get out of those trucks so that they could bomb them. Of course, they're not going to get out. So that's just a long way of saying that I think the Obama's record on terrorism was a political weakness, and because of that, he didn't want to elevate the attention on terrorist issues, whereas President Trump is, I think, exactly the opposite.
The opposite. But then it came in a time that now Europe feels differently about dealing with Iran, and you're saying it's because of also some personal feelings about President Trump specifically. But how different are they now for the U.S.? I mean, until what's the limit that Europe would keep trying to push to basically keep negotiating with Iran, keep Iran in a nuclear deal, help Iran avoid the sanctions? I mean, what could they do, and how much would they actually be pushing?
Yeah. I think in addition to the political angle with the Trump administration, many European countries also have vested economic interests in trade with Iran. And it may not be all that great compared to their trade with the U.S., but they're reluctant to give it up. And I think they still hold out hope of some kind of evolving regime in Iran. And I think at heart, implicitly, and President Obama said it explicitly sometimes, is that But implicitly, the Iranian nuclear deal didn't make any sense unless you presumed that the regime was going to change and moderate its policies, because it repeatedly had violated the same nuclear commitments that it made once again. And why wouldn't it do that in the future? I think the Europeans engaged in wishful thinking about the nature of the regime, and that led them to prefer their normal course, which is not taking action to address a threat, especially if it leads to economic problems. But for the U.S., that situation didn't hold.
In terms of the, I mean, right now we know that some of the European companies are pulling out of Iran, but then others are trying to make, basically create a loophole where they can keep working there. How much can they do that, in your opinion?
Well, European governments have said they're going to create this blocking statute, and they have. It's in effect now. The problem is European companies don't want to use that blocking statute because they have a lot more invested in trade with the U.S. than trade with Iran. So they're voting with their wallets and they're pulling out of Iran. But for political reasons, the EU and some of the European governments remain committed to that blocking statute. But that's doomed to fail. That won't protect Iran from U.S. sanctions. It can mitigate the damage of some of the sanctions and make them less effective, but it can't block them completely. And we've already seen not only European companies voting with their wallets, but Iranians have voted with their wallets and are trying to gain control of gold or American dollars to protect themselves from the great fall off in the value of the Iranian currency. So they see, what's coming, and that'll make it increasingly difficult for the regime to continue funding all its terrorist apparatus and propping up Assad and doing its missile program, and if it starts its nuclear program up again, that'll be even more expensive. So it's got to make some very hard decisions now.
In terms of, there's a very important point that I want to go back to, which is about that the only solution to basically counter the nuclear weapon in Iran is going to be a military solution that we don't hear a lot of talking about from this administration. We heard the opposite from the president when he said he wants to sit down and meet up with the Iranians, he said, Iranians. But also there's the Israeli position who completely is against Iran developing a nuclear weapon. There's a lot of, many experts who say that Iran is already is so far beyond a certain point where they can actually have a nuclear weapon in a couple of months.
Well, I think the president's goal remains barring Iran permanently from gaining a nuclear weapon. And he's willing to sit down and negotiate, but he would not, unlike his predecessor, sign off on a deal that gave Iran a way of marching to a nuclear weapon. Although President Obama said that agreement permanently blocked that path, really it was only a temporary diplomatic speed bump that delayed Iran's program, but allowed them to ramp up uranium enrichment after the key restrictions ended in 10 to 15 years, and they could march right up to a nuclear breakout and then choose the time when it was convenient for them to violate the nuclear proliferation. President Trump will not go for that, and you can be sure that as long as John Bolton is his national security advisor. Bolton has long experience on nuclear proliferation issues going back to the Bush administration. And he will not sign off on that kind of an agreement.
What about Israel? Does Israel have the option to militarily do something about it in case things spiral out of control?
I think Israel could temporarily set back the Iranian program if push came to shove, and if they ended up doing a preventive strike against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But the problem is you can't bomb knowledge, and so you'd have to go back again and again to make sure that the Iranians don't rebuild those facilities. And so that would be a long-term military commitment. It's not going to be just, you know, 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
It would have to be going back again and again, or as the Israelis say, mowing the grass.
Mowing the grass is going to be like a constant thing in order to prevent Iran from doing this. In terms of North Korea, and before I move to my last point, but I want to talk about North Korea, you know, those meetings between President Trump, the meeting, and Kim Jong-un, in your opinion, and now there's the negotiations, where do you think this is heading, and how significant is that for this American president to be able to achieve any type of deal with a North Korean president?
In my mind, I think the North Korean president agreed to sit down at a summit in order to diffuse international pressure against North Korea. And already we're seeing him step up negotiations with South Korea, and the North Koreans are stalling on some of the concessions that they promised to give President Trump. I mean, they have come across with some things in terms of returning the bodies of dead American servicemen from the Korean War, but they have yet to take significant and irreversible steps to dismantle their nuclear infrastructure. And so I doubt that there ever will be an acceptable final agreement, at least as long as John Bolton is a National Security Council advisor.
What do you mean by that?
I think there could be incremental steps to diffuse tension between North Korea and the U.S. or between North Korea and South Korea. Perhaps the North Koreans may, if they're smart, stop their missile tests, and maybe, you know, they've already dismantled one test facility, but there was evidence that that facility was damaged and couldn't be used anymore anyway. So that was a wash. But you know, there could be some incremental progress, but I don't think the North Koreans will ever give up all their nuclear weapons. And if there is an agreement, I think it would be more like an agreement that Assad signed on chemical weapons, where he says he's going to give up his chemical weapons, but he really doesn't.
Then what would be the solution for some problem like the North Korean problem?
Well, the long-term solution would be a change of regime there, but then again, that's not something you can predict. So, you know, if there's enough international buy-in on sanctions with Russia and China, then there could be set up a cost-benefit calculus for the North where it would somehow freeze its nuclear program but not flaunt it. And even that would be an unstable situation. So I'm not sure there is
a solution.
Yeah, a realistic diplomatic solution. I think there can be least bad answers to the problem, but they won't fully resolve the underlying problems.
In terms of Iran, there was always, you know, with this administration too, I mean, we know that people like John Bolton, they believe in the Iranian regime change. But what do you think of the slogan from this administration? Some people criticize them for that. They use it sometimes and sometimes they don't use it. I mean, what do you think of that slogan, changing the Iranian regime as the only way to basically get rid of all these problems, the drug dealing, the spread of terrorism, and the nuclear threats?
You know, I think a strong case can be made that the nuclear issue will not be resolved as long as that regime is in power, given its revolutionary DNA and knee-jerk anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, and the totalitarian nature of the regime, which it wants to export its revolution to surrounding countries. That said, President Trump did not like the end results of regime change in Iraq against Saddam Hussein or in Afghanistan against the Taliban. And the problem with regime change is then the U.S. has to go in and build a new regime, and you know, maybe the new regime isn't all that was promised. You know, we've seen problems with the Iraqi government vis-a-vis Iran too. So I think to me, the bottom line is that if there's going to be regime change in Iran, it's going to come from the Iranian people. The U.S. cannot orchestrate it. The U.S. can support the Iranian people, publicize the issues that motivate them, the oppression of the regime, the violation of human rights, impose sanctions on the regime to weaken it. But I don't think the U.S. Is going to directly support regime change in Iran. That's up to the Iranian people.
And could the administration help the Iranian people enough with the economical sanctions and other means for them to do it internally?
I think the administration is trying to do that, but it's unclear if that's possible. I mean, to me, I don't see a revolution as being possible in Iran until the oil workers join the strikes and join the rebels, and that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
But that is the Achilles heel of the regime, is control over oil, and if they lose that, then I think things could change quickly.
So the oil in Iran.
I think the oil workers are a key revolutionary constituency. They were very important in the 1978-79 revolution. Right now, I haven't seen any evidence that they're taking action against the regime. And until that happens, I just don't see revolution as possible in Iran.
Oh my God, but that's a very important point that you mentioned. I want to end the show here. Thank you so much, Jim, for giving us the time today, and I'd love to have you again soon in the future.
Okay, thank you.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.